How are y'all doing? Good. It's nice to see you all. Thank you so much for coming to the event tonight. This is the project of, as you can see on the screen here, a lot of folks have helped to bring this event together at a very important time in our history, our present. So I'm excited to be here. My name is Karma Chavez. I'm the chair of the Department of Mexican American and Latino Studies and affiliated with many of the other units that are sponsoring this event. So it is my great privilege to introduce our panel tonight. And yes, there's, food in the hallway, so you can always feel free and step out and come back in since we're approaching the dinner hour. But let me go ahead and introduce our panelists this evening. So our moderator tonight is going to be Dr. Danielle Pilar Cleland. She's an associate professor of Mexican American and Latino Studies at UT here and has a courtesy appointment in African Diaspora Studies. Her research examines Black politics, group consciousness, Black public opinion, and racial inequality with a focus on the Spanish-speaking Caribbean and the United States using an interdisciplinary approach. Professor Angela Ocampo is the newest faculty member of the Department of Mexican American and Latino Studies, joining us this year as an assistant professor. Professor Ocampo specializes in the study of race and ethnicity in U.S. politics with a specific focus on the Latinx community. She teaches courses on political behavior and representation, minority politics, immigration and citizenship, and Latinx politics. Dr. Arnold Jin is an affiliate of the Center for Asian American Studies. Arnold began his legal career as a civil rights attorney with the American Civil Liberties Union of Washington, where he managed the Government Surveillance Project, which focused on the intersection of race, privacy, technology, and the warrantless surveillance of private citizens through legislation and litigation. Dr. Michael A. Goodman is a higher education and student affairs educator whose research focuses on student governance and involvement. Goodman's research involves college student government, the student body presidency, and sorority fraternity life, including equity and justice issues, experiences of new professionals, queer students, social justice, and social media and bias response in sorority and fraternity life. We also have with us Dr. Amira Rose Davis. She's an assistant professor in the Department of African and African Diaspora Studies here at UT, where she specializes in 20th century American history with an emphasis on race, gender, sports, and politics. Recently named a Mellon Emerging Faculty Leader by the Institute for Citizens and Scholars, she's finishing up her first book, Can't Eat a Medal: The Lives and Labors of Black Women Athletes in the Age of Jim Crow. And finally, Dr. Angie Gutierrez is a Provost Early Career Postdoctoral Fellow. Using observational data and survey experiments, her research examines the role of political threat on Latino identity and political participation. She has co-authored articles and book chapters on Latino voting and produced many research reports as part of the Latino Policy and Politics Initiative at UCLA. She also consults political organizations and political campaigns on the Latino electorate. So please join me in welcoming our panelists, and I'll turn it over to you, Danielle.
Thank you, Dr. Chavez. Welcome. Can everyone hear me? Welcome, everyone. I'm really glad to see all of these faces. I want to thank our panelists for being here. I also would really like to thank the staff that worked on all of this. This was a big endeavor, and so, we're really grateful that we have such awesome people working with us. So, I want to start by saying that we have been registering voters here today, and so obviously the idea here is to talk about elections, to talk about why they're important, to talk about why you are important and what you can do to get more involved. Obviously, this is a very high-stakes election, and we all are, I assume, I hope, paying attention to what's happening and how politics are changing, particularly here in Texas. And so we definitely want to talk about that. And so I wanted to start a little bit by talking about democracy, how we might define it. Currently, we have in the Supreme Court cases that are going to decide what is happening with the Voting Rights Act and whether we can still count on the Voting Rights Act. And so with that in mind, as political scientists, we usually define democracy as something to do with free and fair elections. I always teach my students that that is not nearly enough, right? We need a far more expansive definition of democracy that includes inequality, that includes access, that includes citizenship. And so I want to think about democracy in a much more expansive way. So with that being said, I want to ask the panel, what are some obstacles to access democracy and voting rights that our groups have experienced? And whoever wants to start may start.
Okay, yeah, I think that the Voting Rights Act is a great place to start because we know historically how important that legislation was. It wasn't a magic wand. It didn't solve racism or anything like that, but it was an important tool in the toolkit of the pursuit of democracy, which is always much more ideal than anything practically felt, I think, for many marginalized groups in this country. And about, what has it been, 7, 8 years in a court case, Shelby County versus Holder, much of that Voting Rights Act was completely decimated. And so it's essentially like having a big piece of bread and the whole middle is taken out. How is that substantive at all for you anymore, right? You're eating air. And I like to think about the Voting Rights Act in its current iteration, and what we've seen is that we've been eating air for the last 7 to 8 years, and what that has resulted in is that it has taken out Section 5, which was what helped monitor and have accountability for places that try to change voting laws really to make them more restrictive. And so this pattern that we've seen with restrictive voting laws being passed that limits access, that closes polling places, are directly because of how the VRA has already started to be assaulted. And I think that I'll toss it off here, but when we think about these barriers to access, specifically around voting, I think we have to put the physical barriers of like long lines and not having the day off and these things up with the general kind of societal conversation that is like, well, because of that, my vote doesn't matter, right? And so I think that in everything that we're talking about, there's always like a kind of all hands on deck approach where we have to understand that voting isn't everything, but it is something. And just because it feels like an uphill battle often, it doesn't mean that we completely disengage from it. So we can still make a meal with that airy bread, and maybe we can come back to putting it together.
I just wanted to interject for 1 second, since this is Elections 101. I want to just say, for those who may not know, that the Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965. And essentially, much of it was to ensure that states would not pass discriminatory laws around voting and access to the polls. And so particularly states that historically had a pattern of having discriminatory laws, particularly disenfranchising Black and then later Latino voters were recognized with this act. Those states had to then ask permission from the Department of Justice to be able to change their rules, right? Because they were known to be discriminatory. And so as that is, right, as the middle of the bread is being taken out, we're seeing more and more redistricting plans that limit the access for marginalized folks to be able to vote. So just to kind of give you a background of the Voting Rights Act, what it means and how it protects certain groups. Okay, and then I'll throw it back to the panel.
So I think it's really important to recognize that even outside of the Voting Rights Act, there are a number of ways where governments are trying to limit people's access to the ballot. So if you think about the vote by mail drop boxes, that's a really big, important issue for a lot of communities. Early access to the polls, Sunday voting in the South. These are ways in which we have traditionally seen Black voters get mobilized, so they would have like souls to the polls, where the buses would go from the churches to the polls on Sundays when people had time off. And states are changing the laws to limit early voting, to limit weekend voting. And these are all things that we need to keep in mind and to think about as like who is actually being hurt by these changes to legislation, and what do the politicians have to gain by trying to limit your access, right? Because they're trying to do it for a reason. If your vote did not matter, they wouldn't try so hard to stop people from voting. They wouldn't be having things like not allowing water in lines, right? That was also some legislation that was passed, that you're not allowed to hand out water or other incentives to voters who are waiting in line. And so I think as voters, it's important for us to really know what our rights are, to know that if you're in line by the time that the polls are supposed to close, you still can vote, even if it's after that cutoff hour, if you're in line. And so we need to make sure that everyone is actively working to combat these different pieces of legislation that are meant to stymie the vote in certain communities.
Yeah, I just want to echo what Angie has said. I think it's important to think about, right, in the backdrop of how much has been chipped away and kind of, out of the air, kind of taken out of the Voting Rights Act. I think it's important not to kind of fall in this sense of feeling despair, disillusionment, partly because I think it's really important to recognize the legacy of those who have fought for us to have the right to vote, right? And so I think that it's important to remember that as we continue to push forward in this, like, a better kind of democracy, right? A democracy that's in process, that we all engage in, that we all try to improve. And by not participating, right, we're letting others choose for us, and we're letting others sort of shape that process. And I completely agree that if it weren't the case that your vote was important, right, like why then are there all of these restrictions to restrict certain particular groups of people from voting, right? And so I think it's important for us to remember this, because it's oftentimes, I think, really challenging to think about, well, what do I do now, right? There's all these restrictions that are passed time and time again, and it seems like there's more towards, or kind of pushing against certain groups of voters to participate. And I think one source of finding strength and thinking about resilience and how we can actively engage in different ways, yes, by voting, but in other ways, is to really, I think, stand on the legacy of our ancestors that, fought for so hard and for so long to be able to give many of us the right to vote. So I think it's important to remember that and to recognize that.
I guess I would just say that, if, in light of the last 50 years, when you talk about the Supreme Court and the Voting Rights Act, really the politicization of the court goes back to the 70s, right, with Robert Bork. And basically one party has played the long game, and they've won. They've won. And the reason why voting matters is, it's not just in the general election. If you look at the court packing plans, or if you just look at the power of the president to nominate a federal judge, and then if you look at senators who then confirm the president's nominee, the reason so many people are apathetic, but the reality is this: they have a 6-3 majority in the court, and I think that when you look at a lot of the legislation that's passed, I mean, gerrymandering absolutely happens. if you talk to your friends on the right, they won't say it in public, but you get them at a bar, you get them behind closed doors, they acknowledge what they do. They know they're gerrymandering, and they know they're drawing the lines to make it more favorable to them. But they have a whole pool of judges, they have representatives that are basically rubber stamping this whole process. And I think what a lot of people fail to acknowledge, at least within the Asian American community, is that they don't understand the significance of the vote. And they also fail to understand that elections, you don't win elections by appealing to your base. You win elections by appealing to those voters that are in the middle, the ones who don't vote in every election. And it's really important that, as I think, to be engaged in our society, that you are excited to vote, and not only that you vote, but you open that access up to everyone else. And so that when they try to pass laws like requiring a driver's license, and a lot of people will say, why do I need, why wouldn't somebody have a driver's license? Because there's a lot of people, if you've been privileged, you've never had to be in a situation where you wouldn't own a car, and you wouldn't have a reason to have a driver's license, then that's a perfect reason why. But there's a lot of people who are uninformed about that. So a lot of it comes down to reading between the lines and kind of looking past, and it's a little disheartening, I understand, when you look at the Supreme Court, but I do believe there will be a course correction, but we have to get people engaged and thinking about it in the right way.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate all of the things that folks have said, and I would echo all those things. I think something I sit with is, as an educator who works in higher ed, so I study higher education, student affairs, educational leadership. When people ask me what I do, I'll often say, like, well, lots of things that are on the news right now about education, like, that's what I do. And it feels like for the first time in a long time, at least in my professional memory, people have actually cared about what's happening in schools and the way that they are at such a high level. And so I think something that, in addition to, all the brilliant things you all mentioned, I think a lot about like what elections look like outside of the context of the big election or the big decisions. And so something that I sit with a lot is this question around school boards. And so I read this article recently, and I'm going to do a disservice to the person who wrote it and not say their name because I can't remember who it was. But they had talked about, like, what does it mean for school boards to reflect the students themselves and the communities that they serve? And then what questions exist around, like, do people even know what they're voting for when they're voting for school boards, or what the role of a school board is in serving the community? I mean, think about all these different spaces where folks have brought up questions around CRT, questions that are really unfounded and there's no knowledge behind the questions that they're raising, or mask mandates, or all these different things that impact students and communities and vulnerable populations. A school board sits at, like, really in some ways, like the genesis of kids' lives and the genesis of, like, the collective forward movement of a community, like educating those, really pre-K through 12. And so what does it mean to see like some stock in school boards as like a valuable part of election discourse and election conversations? That's something that I'm spending a lot of time thinking about, maybe too much time thinking about it, but I wanted to offer that in addition to those great thoughts you brought forward.
That's a perfect segue into my plug for our next event, which is later in October, called Ballot 101, where we will go over the ballot. Many of us, perhaps know who the governor is. We know who our, representatives are in the House, and I hope. But a lot of us don't know who we're voting for when it comes to school boards, when it comes to the city council, when it comes to judges. And so we're going to be talking about that as well on the 25th. So the other thing that I wanted to mention was that, there are a lot of policies that we might not think about as being related to voting that certainly are. So when we think about, immigration reform and path to citizenship, that's very much related to who has access to vote and who has access to citizenship. And so many of these policies that restrict not only access to voting, but restrict citizenship, restrict residency, right? Support deportation. A lot of that is wrapped around who has power, who has access to the vote, and keeping the political status quo. And so when we're thinking about, these other policies, we have to understand how they all are related to access and democracy. So, as we've talked about, the election is a midterm election. And so historically, because a president is not running, midterm elections have been a bit low on the turnout numbers. It's getting a little better as people are starting to care more in the past couple of years, but overall, midterm turnout is low. And so for this particular election, we really want to encourage people to talk to other folks, talk to people in their families, try to get folks registered and out to vote. And so this election, despite being a midterm election, has very high stakes, as I said in the beginning. And so what I wanted to ask the panel is, why is it so important for this particular election to get involved, especially for state and local politics?
I'll get started. Yeah. So I think it's really important to think about your local politics, to think about your school board, as you were mentioning. In the United States, what has happened, in the last 10, 20 years is the focus on politics has gotten so national, where we think of everything as like a winner take all, red versus blue. I'm only going to, vote for the Democrats or vote for the Republicans, without actually stopping to think about, what about these other races? What about my state legislature? What about my city council? What about my school board? So these are all really important things. The state legislature especially, they're the ones who do the redistricting lines every 10 years. So if we're not paying attention to those races, if we don't have candidates who are running in these places, those are lost opportunities to have a bigger impact in terms of the bigger national story that we all care about so much. And what we have to remember is, politics is won by inches. Small little wins are what are going to amount to these big dramatic changes that we want to see over time. And paying attention to things like your city council is also really important, because a lot of people who started the city council end up going further up along the political chain. And your city council also does things like pass laws on homelessness, on city resources, on things that directly impact your community and your everyday life. And so these are things that a lot of people don't pay attention to, but actually might have a bigger impact on their day-to-day lives than if we were to focus only on the presidential races.
Yeah, and I think that Texas is really important. We are in a state that is very important. So our local politics here, it's very easy to see the direct line between the local and the national and the global, really situated where we are. A lot of the cases that are brought to the Supreme Court for a number of really big issues started here, right? This is the proving ground. It's the petri dish. And so thinking about that, even something like school boards, I literally wrote that right before you said it, because it's so important. But the ways in which local school boards or fights over textbooks might seem trivial, but then when you think about how many textbooks this state distributes and how many other states actually just use them, you can see how it maps onto the web of larger issues. And I think that thinking about the local is really instructive, not because in and of itself it's really important, but I think it's also one way to help boost engagement, as you were saying, because oftentimes I know, especially I doom scroll, the world is on fire, what are we doing? It can be very easy to feel lost in that, and very easy to feel well, how could I possibly engage with this issue or that issue? And the great thing about local politics is, first of all, you don't have to ever really invent a new wheel. You can perfect one that's already going. You can jump on board. There's local organizations and grassroots organizers, right, who are in the trenches working on these things way before elections happen. They're ready to meet that moment, right? So one of the big things that we're seeing right now, of course, is about reproductive freedom. It's about bodily autonomy. And there are grassroots organizations that have been anticipating the fall of Roe for years and have laying the groundwork and the foundation to try to combat it, and just need to be poured into, right, to meet these moments. And so I think that we're in a position with literally being in Texas at a time where we're seeing these culture wars, as they're called, which are really just, I don't know why we put it in brackets, they're not real or whatever, but they're harmful. We're in the mix of where things are really setting the course of a lot of other conversations. And so it's a great moment to kind of be invited into that local work, and from the school boards to the city councils to state leg in a state where state leg has so much power over this university, right? Not every state has this much power over its state university. Just move from Pennsylvania, where the state leg could be like, whatever they say, everybody at Penn State would laugh at them, right? Like, Texas state leg has a direct impact to like our daily lives. If anybody, parents, kids in K through 12, like the pandemic was a lesson in how firsthand that was, when we were quite literally being tasked with like sending our kids to school and fighting about masks, right? Fighting about books that are being banned, fighting about something simple like the TEA, the Texas, the laws around like how Texas teachers can unionize is directly impacting turnover, people leaving these educational spaces. Like, these are daily things. And so sometimes breaking down what voting is and what it encompasses by focusing on a tangible thing that people care about and that impacts them day to day is that entry point into what sometimes feels so beyond us.
When I first got here, I'm a year in at UT, and when I first got here, one of the things I kept hearing was like, we can see the Capitol from the middle of campus, and that was the explicit thing that was being said, but I think what was being implied is that we can see the Capitol from campus and they can see us back, and I think that also is part of why I think the institution does or doesn't respond in certain ways, and then I feel like that trickles down. I remember last year when the lieutenant governor had that anti-trans directive that was so harmful and so dangerous, and there were a lot of queer and trans students on campus looking around saying, are y'all gonna talk about this? Are you gonna say something? Even in the College of Education, we had those same questions, and I think that certainly, made attention, but not in the same way that benefits privileged queer people. When I think about like hierarchies within the community, in particular, I'm thinking about a lot of cis, white, gay men and bi men in particular who feel like equality was achieved when marriage equality happened, and there was this kind of like it's overness around queer issues. And so when there are issues impacting trans and non-binary people, especially in communities, when we think about even just like there's the athletics piece, and there's also the piece related to like bathrooms and locker rooms that are safe for folks that don't say gay, quote unquote, don't say gay. And then also, what is this piece about documentation and ability to have records reflect who you actually are? So when we think about even like hindrances to voting, it's for some trans and non-binary people, their records don't match who they are. And so it's a matter of like outing oneself in a space like voting, or in a space that's really perhaps unsafe for them to be able to even show up and then to try to vote for something that matters. And so I feel like, and especially as I think about the work I've done in queer spaces, is this like, there's this leveraging of like what matters to us, what doesn't matter to us, and like putting weight on certain things. And in a lot of ways, especially trans people of color end up getting the least amount of support, because there is this, again, this kind of white dominance within queer spaces that says like, well, we've arrived because we have Obergefell, which, y'all, there's a suggestion that there's also this piece that's going to be, so I think that maybe perked some ears of some queer community, some members of the queer community, but still not all. And so what does it mean to have like an enough-ness around what even brings me to the polls, or what even brings me to show up to vote? Do those things happening at that local level or at my state level, like, are they impacting me? Are they hitting me? When I think about UT in the context of the Lieutenant Governor's anti-trans directive, I would say the institution didn't pay any mind to that or any attention to that. I think there were pockets. I think about LGBT studies, the GSC, but ultimately the institution still was largely really silent on that, and thus I think led some faculty members to also feel like, and certainly students, can I say or do anything here? My research on student government, I usually go right over to student government and say like, well, what are y'all doing? How are y'all approaching this? What things are you all doing? Sometimes student governments are really great in that way, and other times student governments are really just a mouthpiece of the institution. And so in what ways then are your student leaders actually advocating for those pieces that students and staff and faculty say, okay, we need this. This is a matter of literal survival and safety for folks.
I guess I'll just kind of build on what my earlier colleagues said about why do state and local elections matter. I could be misattributing this quote, but I believe it was Justice Sandra Day O'Connor that said that states are the laboratories, right? We get to test out these ideas, and even at the local level, like I worked on the cannabis legalization in Washington State in 2012. It was a successful campaign. And if you look at just weed legislation, 25 years ago, they never would have thought that we would be on the precipice of where we have over 30 states have recreational or at least some kind of medical marijuana law in the books. The discussion has changed, and it's because you see so many states adopt these laws, and other people, they follow suit. They're like, what are the benefits for our people? Is this something that a framework like this that could work at this level? And I've also worked on legislation that we had to first pass at the local level when we're talking about the unlawful surveillance of private citizens. And you can get these issues germinated at that local level. You start getting it on people's minds, then you get it passed at the state level, and it builds a trickle-up effect. It really does. And so that is why local elections absolutely matter. And it's true what she said about how a lot of times there could be a difference of just a few hundred votes. And I can't tell you how many times I've heard of people who are interested in the elections, but they just don't care enough, or they're just too busy, and they just can't spare the however much time it takes to get out there. So I think, yes, every election matters. And not only that, a lot of times you will have a direct impact on electing judges. Most judges are going to be elected, and they play a tremendous role in our criminal justice system. So if you think about that, and even if you're not that well versed in all the issues, but you pay attention to the judges, you could save someone's life. You literally could save someone's life. So that's why these elections matter.
Yeah, I'll just reiterate that elections, right, these elections that we're all talking about, local elections, are many times just won by very few votes, right? So to those who may think, right, why does it matter? Is my vote going to matter? I'm just one person in the aggregate. If you take it away, does it matter? They actually do matter in these local elections. And it is about issues of saving someone's life. It's about issues at the local level, public works, right? When we think about the Flint water crisis, right, and you really think about people's livelihoods and what could have been done but wasn't done, or what went wrong, this is all happening at the local level. So I think we have to think about the impact that our local, state governments have on our everyday lives, as we're talking about reproductive rights, and what our state legislature and our governor has done, right, in thinking about basically forfeiting access for reproductive health for women in our state. And so we have to really think about that and recognize that all of this is happening at the state level, and we can certainly make an impact.
And can I just add on to that? Because I think you gesture to it, but like, we have experienced a failed state in Texas for the last few years. Like, that's what a winter storm that hurts and harms people looks like, right? That's like, I mean, some of my family's in Mississippi. Jackson doesn't have water. Some of my family's in Puerto Rico. They don't have electricity, right? These natural disasters have man-made effects. And when we experience what it looks like to have a government not function, right, and not care, sometimes it robs us of our imagination of what it could be functioning as. And I think that's really important to think about. So when we're putting ideas on the table about what is at stake right now, it's the conversations about bodily autonomy, about climate change, about guns, right? All of these things compound and intersect with each other. It's impossible to talk about marijuana legislation without understanding the disparate, racial harmful effects of the war on drugs that we're still feeling. And so they're all kind of bound up together, which is why it's easy to draw these lines between the local and the national and the global, et cetera. But I think that we're at a very important moment because we're also at a time where we're coming off like a very involved national election that was supposed to shift power, but we saw doesn't necessarily feel all that different. And I think that we're in a moment that is requiring dreamers and requiring people to say, well, what can we swing for to feel materially different so that we're not looking at a failed power grid, right? That we're not like chasing the same graphs, like scraps that we have been, right? And I think that this is a moment that almost feels like the stakes are high because there's a referendum on that. Like it's like we're meeting the backlash, and it's like, well, what do we counter that with? And so I think part of the reasons why this midterm feels so heightened, it's because it feels like if this hasn't brought you to the brink of reconsidering the status quo in Texas politics, it feels like what's happening, what's going on here, you know what I mean? So I think that those are some of the like on the ground stakes that we're feeling right now.
Just this morning in my class, I was talking to my students about ideology and quoting Mary Jackman, who talks about the best way to maintain the status quo is to limit the vision, of subordinates. And so I'm, so glad you said, we have to expand our vision, because if we don't, then we're going to just assume that this is the best we can do. So I wanted to then move to some of your thoughts about how we can get involved, perhaps beyond voting, and also how we might challenge some of the political apathy that we see. Because really, what it comes down to in Texas, and this was reinforced as we saw what happened in the national election, particularly in Georgia, we have to get people out to vote. The only thing that's going to turn this around is turnout. And so what are some of the ways that we can, address apathy, in Texas in particular?
That's a great question.
I'll take a crack.
Yeah.
I think one of the issues we have is that a lot of people are very single issue voters, right? I talk to my students about this all the time because I know my students' parents politically are very different from how my students lean. And the most common refrain I hear is that, well, I'm looking at how my stocks are doing. Whoever the president is, regardless of what party they're in, if my stocks are down, I'm gonna vote that person out. And so I think, number one, it doesn't mean that I think we're not trying hard enough to have a conversation, right? With people who may not vote in every election or those who are not as aware of the issues. So I think number one, it starts at a very grassroots level in engaging people and figuring out what's important to them. Because if you don't talk to other people, how are you gonna know what's important to them? And I think that is something that both the national parties have failed in doing, but I would say that the messaging on one side is not as consistent or as good as on the other side. And so I think we really have to be willing to, number one, have these conversations and start asking people like, are you registered to vote? Why aren't you registered to vote? Ask them, and if you really start engaging with them and asking them questions and helping them to see why it matters, then I think you will have a little bit more impact on the overall turnout rate, when it comes to midterms or general elections.
Yeah, I think one of the challenging things about addressing apathy around voting and participation is kind of getting at the root of it. So I think you have to meet folks where they're at, right? I think you have to figure out what the source of that apathy is, and oftentimes that begins with a conversation, with talking about, well, why are you not interested, or what's preventing you? Is it lack of information? Is it lack of resources? And I think meeting where folks are at in terms of their apathy to politics can be sort of the beginning of a potential conversation where you can get folks, perhaps when you can maybe light up a little spark around issues that they might care about, right? They may not care about the presidential election, or they might not really care about the two political parties or whatever, but they might care about one particular thing, right? If they have children, they might be interested in what their children are not learning in schools. Or if they care about other things that are impacting their community, like access to food or access to transportation. Those are other things that you can mobilize folks around, and you can get them interested in politics, right? It doesn't really have to be your canonical, the party system, but you can begin to engage folks where they're at, right? By getting a sense of what's the source of apathy and kind of being that intermediary who kind of says well, there's more to politics than what you see on TV or by the quote unquote culture wars that it's sort of being portrayed in the media and oftentimes kind of reiterating that way. So I think that's one way to begin to engage folks who express apathy around engaging. And I think the other thing too is to let people know, right, that there are many ways of participating beyond voting, right? Voting is only one of them, but you can just begin, right, with your classmates, with your peers on campus. There are so many organizations on this campus doing so much work, right? And so if you're a particular member of a particular community and you just want to give back to that community, you can start in that way, right? And that's one way in which you can maybe bring along one of your classmates who has expressed apathy around participation, and you can say, hey, we're having this drive to do X, Y, and Z. Why don't you come along? It's on Friday. They'll give us food. It's great, right? You can sort of begin to help spark that little interest in whatever issue you might be able to relate to that person. And then that can be the beginning of something that can become much more transformational down the road into changing that apathy into actual interest and eventual engagement.
And I think it's important to note, if you're like, I really want to do this, but I'm worried that I won't say the right thing or I don't have all the information, whatever, there's some other ways that you can think about engagement. So linking up with those organizations, those are great things because you can learn as you do it. Here's some other tangible things that we can think about. We're in the final push for voter registration. So encouraging people the same way that you get those fun little stickers when you vote and everybody wants them and post them on social media, can do the same thing about registration, right? I'm registered, are you? Simple, easy, but it's out there, it circulates. Ask for class off on November 8th. I literally just had a student remind me, and it's because when I was setting my syllabus, I just wasn't looking at the calendar. So I'm just blah, 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 here, this is what we're doing. And they were like, hey, can we do? And I'm like, yeah, we're not having class. I changed my syllabus, right? Because we know that one of the places that's targeted to suppress the vote are college campuses. So expect long lines, right? And I don't want that to be a negotiation, so there's just no class. You can ask of that if you have class on Tuesday. Ask your peers to ask of that. Organizations like Pizza to the Polls or Elders to the Polls, right, which help provide food and nourishment, where it's legal, to those in line, or get people, if you have a means of transportation. If you don't have a car, there's places that will help you buy a bus pass, right, or participate in this carpool. And then if you're somebody, I think as much as we meet people where they are, also know yourself. And if you know you're really good on TikTok, make a TikTok about why you're voting, right? And lastly, I study sports, so I've worked with the WNBA over the last few years, who were influential in swaying the Georgia election. We know, right, how much impact they had. And one of the things I think is really instructive is in that moment, they moved from a model of being voting is important. Not every vote has the same outcome. What I mean by that is that there's voting for people that will actively continue harm and voting for people who won't. And what they chose to do beyond saying vote, 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 is they decided to wear shirts endorsing who they were backing, and they focused on why, and they connected those issues with the issues that the community cared about, and they didn't reinvent the wheel. So they coordinated with grassroots activists in Georgia who knew the lay of the land, who knew what doors to knock on, and they said, where can my presence help in this way? So sometimes it's just about showing up to places that are doing the work and saying, here's my toolkit. How can I help here? And you don't have to have all the answers when you take that first step to do it. It might be that you just Venmo a bunch of people water on that day, and that's a place to start. But these are the entry points that might be some tangible things to consider.
I really love that. And I think about that in the connection to kind of transcending typical spaces. So what would it mean for someone's at the Kind Clinic getting an STI test for the clinician to say and as you're leaving, just want to remind you, are you registered to vote? And do you have a plan for voting? Or do you know what's at stake in the context of your sexual health? I mean, trying to make those connections that also make sense in certain spaces. I went to the movies this weekend, and there were two very sweet women who were sitting behind a table at the movie theater, and they were asking folks. And so it's what does it look like and mean to transcend those kind of typical spaces. And just the last quick thing I'll add related to that is, what does it also mean to plug in, especially as you think about being students? I'd mentioned student government. I'm a student government researcher, and looking at student government, it's a microcosm of local, state, federal, and national government. And so student government, essentially these leaders that you all elect, are responsible for 50,000 constituents. And they get seats at the table. So they're meeting with Hartzell, they're meeting with the provost. They have access more than I do as a faculty member. I've met him once, and it was at the new faculty thing, and I was like, oh, who are you? Nice to meet you, cool. But the student government president, they usually get a meeting with that person often. And so I think about that too, about what access might mean as well to being in some of those spaces. And also that's still a very elitist space. It's still, there's a lot of historical issues with student government, but trying to break into that and trying to find a way to use that as a space that also offers voice. If the student body is saying something, it's a little easier for the institution to listen when their leaders are actually actively working for their constituents and their community, opposed to leaders who are just, again, another speaker for the institution.
And the last thing I just want to say on this is, like, I think a lot of people do want to vote or think about voting, but then they feel like they don't have enough information to actually go vote. And I think it's important for people who do vote to share where they get their resources. This is, I use this voter guide, or be a voter guide yourself. I have, 10 people call me and say, hey, what are we voting for this? And then, so if you turn your own platform into like a, hey, I voted for this, or like you can use this voter guide from the newspaper, that's a really great way to help your immediate friends and your immediate network get that information that they're going to need to feel confident about voting.
Thank you. Okay, so we're running out of time. My very last question, and maybe I'll throw it to the panel, but also perhaps folks in the audience would like to answer, because we do want to open it up to Q&A. And so, we're in this moment where all of the issues, when I say that this is a high stakes election, particularly for the communities that we're representing here, these issues are deeply personal. And so, we're being challenged at the university level as to, what we can teach and how we can teach it, right? Particularly when we're thinking about critical race theory. If we have children in K through 12, we have to be concerned about what they're going to be learning because of what is being restricted as far as curriculum is concerned. Right? Families with trans children are being investigated. Our reproductive rights as women have virtually been eliminated. We have this issue with gun control that doesn't seem to be moving despite this horrific tragedy that happened in Uvalde. And so, what do we do with all of this? Within our communities, how do we take care of ourselves? How do we cope with this? And at the same time, be involved. I mean, I know I personally, I project it out, right? And so I talk about it a lot, and I make sure folks are aware of what's happening, but that might not work for others, right? Some might want to retreat. And so when we're in this moment where it's really important to be involved, how do perhaps you all, deal with these kind of very personal and enraging issues, and then perhaps we can throw it out to the audience, and then I want to open up for questions.
I guess if the question relates to kind of like how do you stay sane during the elections, as which is kind of what I'm reading between the lines. The first thing I would say is don't watch too much television. Avoid. I mean, you have to absorb a little bit, right? But television, I don't care what network it is, they're basically paid to gin up the controversy, right? I mean, they make the issue a lot more sensational than it is. And so, especially as it gets closer to the election time, that's really what their agenda is. So I think you have to kind of be able to sift through a lot of the fluff or a lot of the kind of noise that's coming out from them. I wouldn't really watch more than you have to, though. The issues, you really know what's at stake, and so I would just try to keep your head calm. I mean, of course, all these issues are very enraging, and we should be upset, but I think we want to channel that in a positive way, right? Instead of just talking about how upset we are, let's talk about other people and see if they're registered to vote. Like, move that conversation in that direction. So that is something I would say is avoid television, avoid the media to the extent possible, and just try to minimize, what you bring in.
So I think personally, I really try to channel whatever emotion I'm feeling at the moment into whatever way helps me best cope with how I'm feeling. But I would say that most of the time I feel a lot of anger, and we know from research that anger is one of the most powerful mobilizers, and that if you channel it into like political activity and political engagement, it does yield activism, it does yield participation, right? So I think you have to think about productive ways and helpful ways that are going to allow you to kind of maintain a sense of, sanity and well-being. But I think at the same time, for me, the way that I've been able to channel anger is by getting involved in whatever way I can, given whatever constraints I have at the moment. I would say, though, that I think it's perfectly okay to retreat, too, right? And I think that there's a lot of exhaustion that happens around the election, and I think that there's a lot of exhaustion around also how much we have to deal with, given who we are in the institution that we are at, kind of carrying a lot of things that we have to do and wearing the many hats that we have to wear in different spaces. So I do want to acknowledge that and say that it is okay to retreat. And I think that you have to think about like where you can find a sense of support and comfort during really difficult times. I think that you all may or may not know, right, kind of different spaces and communities on campus where you can be who you are and kind of be vulnerable. And I think it's important to remember that there are those communities that do have your back amidst all of the kind of crazy things that are happening. And so those are, I think, the two ways in which one can channel whatever one is feeling at the moment. But I think you do have to, if you're feeling angry, I think it's important, and if you can, channel that into organizing, mobilizing in whatever way you can. And if you're not feeling up for it, it's okay to give yourself the time to heal and to be in a good place so that you can then organize and engage later on.
Yeah, I'm a huge protect your peace person. I don't know what week of the semester it is, but the fall semester is just a grueling thing. Like, burnout is real. We're just gonna go to Thanksgiving, we're gonna come back, it's gonna be done, right? Like, it's just, this is what we're doing right now. And I think that, like, finding those you can exhale with, like, who are the folks in your community, in your friend group, what group chat do you go to when you just need to pop off a voice note real fast, right? That's really important, right? Because especially if you're like me and you doom scroll a lot, I need the friends who are gonna be like, you have spent way too much time invested in trying to get people to believe that mermaids can be black and that elves can be black, right? Like I'm just, like, sometimes you just need that person who's like, let it go, right? Because like, why am I like carrying that? I can't carry that, we're juggling too much. And I think it's important to know, it's like my favorite thing to remind myself all the time, is that we're juggling a lot. We have a lot of responsibilities to many different things. And I think that what I do that grounds me is I try to remember which of those balls I'm juggling are glass and which are plastic. What can you drop and it would like shatter? You like really need to do that, right? Like go to the dentist or whatever it is. And what is plastic and will bounce back up, right? And that is instructive because then you can let it go. Maybe you want to get involved in like 3 different organizations because you have 3 passion projects, but 2 of them might need to be let go so that you can stay grounded and protect your own peace, and know that that ball will pop back up because this plastic is just rolling on the ground. You can get it any time. And that's true for a number of different things in the juggling act. And I think that knowing your outlets, whether you're watching like Bake Off or you're, doing like ratchet Peloton rides, that's me. Whatever it is that like helps you do that, especially if you're plugged in. Because It's real, and we live in a time where it gets mediated through us constantly, right? It doesn't matter if you're on Instagram, on TikTok, on Twitter, none of those things, but you're just hearing it because people are sharing it with you. If you're just in conversations, it can be hard to turn the world off. And I think the challenge is that I think that you want to stay engaged. It's like when you put your computer to sleep, but it's still really on. Like, you stay plugged into the world, but you know how to protect your peace so that when you're moving with rage, it's productive, right, for you in ways that is not draining and not taking from you. And I think that part of accessing that space is leaning into yourself and then finding that community around you that will fortify you as you, move through the world.
Yeah. So I think all of that is really great advice. I also tend to want to organize and to mobilize and to do things when I get angry, when I get frustrated with politics. I'm a little bit more of an introvert, though. And campaigns are very loud, and they have a lot of big personalities involved. So finding ways for me as an introvert means that I will get lists of addresses and write postcards at home. And so my husband and I will write postcards. We'll make all of the donor lists and make like a Twitter link to send out to find ways to donate. And this is the way that we feel like we can help. So I think a lot of people will tell you, go organize, go do things, but do things in a way that makes you feel comfortable, but still makes you feel like you're helping. And you are helping. We do need people to write the postcards. If you're willing to make the phone calls, you can make the phone calls from your house now. They have good technology to do that. That's less fun than writing the postcards. But, there are ways to still be engaged without having to actively join a group that I think a lot of people don't really know about. Or maybe don't do as often, but that are still really good opportunities.
Yeah. I think just lastly, I would say for me, I sit with this responsibility in the sense of using my privilege for good. So I'm a gay person, and I'm also white, and I'm cis, and I'm a man. And so what does it mean to hold these identities and also use my privileges for good? So for example, when there are conversations and threats to trans and non-binary people, I don't identify as trans or non-binary. And so what does it mean then to hold space for trans and non-binary folks? What does it mean to hold space for students of color in my classes or on campus, to show up to events, to recharge and to also step back when I need to think about the ways that perhaps I'm experiencing different things in society or on campus, but I also feel this calling to use my privilege for good. And so I feel like that, to me, especially when I think about checking in on students, being on a campus where there are, especially queer and trans students, looking around the College of Education and not seeing a lot of, or if any, trans faculty. And so what does it mean then to hold that space so that the trans faculty on campus don't feel overwhelmed by every single trans and non-binary student coming to them as a place of safety? And so I can't understand all of their experiences, but at the same time, I can at least hold that space. And so I think that gives me some sense of peace to be able to say, I can hold this space for you. I can't hold the things that you're holding, but I can certainly hold that space. Also, letting students out of class. I think attendance policies are bananas. So when there's real life happening and there's real threat happening to people, asking them to still come to class, and in my case, sit for 3 hours, that's the universe saying agree. Exactly. So to sit for 3 hours and then act like that stuff is not happening around them. So what does it mean to say to students yeah, it's not that deep. You can miss class because your health is literally, and your safety is so much more important than holding this space. And so I think those are things that I try to think about, try to model in my spaces. And the last thing is I also try to disrupt through my research. So at the beginning of my introduction, I researched sororities and fraternities in different ways, specifically looking at transphobia, homophobia, and racism baked into fraternity and sorority life, in the history of fraternity and sorority life. And I try to write really ridiculous things that piss off a lot of people who hold a lot of value in those entities and organizations. And I'm a member myself, so I feel like that's also the call is coming from inside the house. But I feel like that's an important way for me to also try to grapple with what's happening and make sense of what's happening. And then I love writing, and so using writing as a way for me to get out of that a little bit and also still make a contribution to our field.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that, to kind of put that all together, part of expanding our vision of what is possible is thinking about politics as community. And so yes, politics is personal, but it doesn't have to be. We can think of politics in a very communitarian way so that we're all looking for levels of rights and access and equality for people other than us, right? And so that's why I'm glad that you shared that, because we're a community. And so if there's an injustice somewhere, right, as we all know, right, the famous quote, right, there's injustice everywhere. We're all facing that injustice. I didn't quote that very well, but you know what I mean. And so we have to pay attention to that, right? We have to stop thinking of politics as what affects me as a person, right? Because we're a society, we're a community, and we're all coming from different places and we're all affected in different ways. But we have to be able to ensure that we're thinking about politics in a justice framework and in a community framework. And we have to also encourage others to think about it that way as well, because that's the only way we're going to really try to tackle a lot of these problems that, I think many folks, a lot of political apathy might come from, well, this doesn't affect me, right? Well, it does, because it affects me and that person and that person. So I want to open it up for questions for the audience. Yes.
I'm Bella, and I was talking about it outside a little bit. Like, I'm a government major, I'm a fourth-year government major, and I have found that my family depends on me a lot to talk about these issues with them. Nobody in my family has ever studied government or anything politics related. They, like, my mom watches CNN and stuff, but that's the extent that they really go to. So I was wondering, how can I take everything I'm learning here and the importance of voting and things they need to pay attention to when voting, bring that back to them, and how can I give them sustainable resources so that they're at some point, because at some point in my life, I'm not going to be able to always remind them to vote or how to vote and all of that. So what kind of resources can I give them in that way to make them a little more independent in that respect?
Well, I'll start by saying that I think that access to information is important. And so, as one of our panelists said, the media is paid to make things more scandalous than they are. They're also paid to hide right, certain stories and not talk about them. And so I think that giving folks around you access to good media and places where they can, understand the issues in a way that's not sensationalized is an important start. And so, and some of that, becomes more difficult if we're talking about bilingual, sources. I mean, it depends, who the family members are. But I think one of the first things is to kind of move out of the CNN, right, and the 24-hour news networks, and really think about resources that we can provide folks that they can read or watch that will educate them in a way that's different from the kind of mainstream media. So I think, that's one of the first things that I think of.
And I think thinking of like non-traditional media forms as well, like I find podcasts to be, I have a podcast, but this is not why. I think it's because sometimes it's easier than reading, right? And it can build a routine where you're just like, you press play, it's in your ear while you're walking the dog or doing the dishes or driving or whatever, right? I think thinking of those non-traditional forms helps expand those resources. I really appreciate your question, Bella, because I think it speaks to also that pressure that that burden it feels like. I know for me, I'm always finding that I need to check my frustration because I realize that it comes a little bit just from being tired. And figuring out how not just to give the information, but to do it in a way that is not condescending and to do it in a way that is that is still providing the same level of discourse that I would want to have with students, with colleagues, whatever. And I think sometimes it can just be tiring. But that is where I think it's really helpful to harness those rages or slip it into moments that is before voting. So when there is an issue that trickled into their sphere because they heard it here, or they like a conversation that doesn't feel like it's connected to voting. Those are the great moments where you can connect it. And so it lessens that like rush right before election, and it can start building those pathways beforehand. And I think that that's, you know, one way to try to lessen that immediate blow that happens.
Yeah, so I will say that your county party pages and your state party pages should have some general information about, you know, which candidates they support and which candidates they don't support. So that's always a good starting point. Whatever newspaper is like your major local newspaper, typically they have some sort of endorsement for the candidates that your parents will vote for in their area. So those are like all good sources to get some of that information quickly and easily. And, you know, the county and state party pages should update that information every election. So I think that's the good part, that it's consistent. You know, I come from California, which gives you a big voter guide that's like this big, and it's more information than you ever really could use on the things that you're voting on. And when I came here to Texas, I was like, where's my voter guide? How am I supposed to get my information? And I think that's like a really big, important hurdle that we need to get over. And so, you know, finding these voter guides, trying to find sources that update is something that I think a lot of voters in Texas struggle with.
Also, Austin Commons was here, and they gave out these great little pamphlets, and so they're also a resource to, you know, to contact and to keep up with. Okay, other questions? Yes.
Thank you guys for being here. I know I came a little late because I got out of my last class of the day, but I have a question about single narrative approaches. You mentioned single issue approaches, but one particular group that I think of that isn't often, I don't think, contextualized in American politics well enough is the immigrant community. How we mentioned before that your parents can often have different views than the students that you have in your classes, and students, college campus, this particular age group tends to be more left, their parents probably more right. So how do you communicate with those that believe they should be voting for a certain party because of the narrative they created around themselves, but they don't follow through on certain promises that they've made? Or like, here's an example. African immigrant family votes blue because the Democratic Party has created this narrative of themselves that they are for people of color, and people of color are supposed to vote for the Democratic Party. Not everybody believes this, of course, but lots of people think people of color vote for the Democratic Party. Then LGBTQ rights begin to be talked about by the Blue Party, more so than the Red Party. But many African immigrants and people that are of the older age group do not align with this, and homophobia is quite common within this community as well. But they have been told that since you are a black person in America, you're supposed to vote for this party. So how do you have conversations with people that believe that they're supposed to vote for a particular party, even if they don't feel that they're fully represented by that party's actions, or when the parties don't follow through on promises they make to certain communities?
Well, I think we're never going to find a party that is actually going to do everything that we want it to do the way that we want them to do it. I think that, like, fundamentally in the way that our system is set up, that is never going to happen. And the way that we have to think about it is, which party do I have more in common with? Which candidates do I have more in common with? We don't even have to think about the party. We can think about the candidates themselves. Who actually represents the values that I believe in? And, you know, for some people, there are going to be some issues that are more important to them, but is that their most important issue? If that's not their most important issue, if you overlap with this other party on all these other criteria, then, you know, maybe the other party is the way to go. But I think that to expect to align on all of the issues is just never really going to end up being what reality looks like.
Yeah,
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say, I think that it's important to think about that even within party that there are a lot of distinctions amongst candidates, amongst issue positions. And so I think that this is why, going back to why local elections are so important, is because oftentimes the candidates and the propositions it's not clear, right, whether or not they are truly Democrats or truly Republican, or even Democrats that could be potentially considered Republican based on what their stance is on a particular topic. So I think it's important to kind of even sort of really think about these distinctions and to consider carefully where candidates stand on a particular issue that might be of interest to you or to whomever is kind of voting on these things. If it is issues of equality and justice and issues that impact the LGBTQ community, right, then that's sort of what you have to be thinking about in mind when choosing to support a particular candidate. But if it's that plus the intersection of that issue plus another issue, then I think you have to start thinking about more holistically about then which candidate seems to be the best fit. I think you get at a question too, which I think it's really interesting, and it's how do we engage and how do we talk about our families that may have a different political affiliation than we do, and I think that's a really hard and challenging thing to do because oftentimes when students spend time in the university and they've taken classes and they come back home and they try to engage with their families who may not have had the experiences that they've had on the college campus, there can be a lot of clashes about, why they're supporting certain issues, why they have certain beliefs. And I don't know that I have the best response for that because I think, it could be really frustrating to try to engage with family members, even if it's not your immediate family, but with other family members who have very different political views from your own. But I think these are the spaces where you can begin to think about and you can convey to your family members the issues that are important to you, and you could explain why you support or don't support certain candidates and or certain issues, right? Because they're deeply personal to you, because they impact your livelihood. And I think at the end of the day, then you'll have to kind of rest on the idea that they care about you, and that at the very least they're going to respect your political beliefs, right? But I think it's sort of very different. I think changing minds is a whole other different conversation. I think it's important just to maintain your identity, but also to be very to try to express to them why you may have certain beliefs or why you may support a particular party or candidate that they don't support.
I want to say that I think when we're thinking about U.S. voting, the way that Black Americans vote, I think is instructive here, because when we're talking about, when I talk about communitarian politics, right, Black folks mostly vote about 90% Democrat. Not all of them agree with the Democrats, right? I am quite disillusioned by the Democratic Party. But at the same time, it's a question of, well, the other party seeks to do me harm. And so, my stocks, might not be soaring, right? Or maybe, I have issues with, abortion rights, or maybe, whatever the issue is that is causing you tension, right, with the Democratic Party. At the end of the day, it comes down to what is best for my community. Right? What is best for my community, and what party is going to do my community the least amount of harm? And so, I think it's a bit of a downer that's the way we have to look at politics, but it is the reality. And so I think that that's the larger picture here, and that is, I think, how I would talk about politics, to my family members, because we are part of this larger community.
And I think that. To your point, changing minds is a different enterprise. This is what we talked about. Voting is one tool, and it's not everything, and it's important, but it has to be bolstered by other work. And so, the ways that it pairs with activism around, protecting trans youth, right, around access to citizenship, right? There's a lot of engaged people who don't have the ability to vote even for a variety of reasons. Those are places in which like you can meet voting and the push for that with other things in your toolkit. And I think that to the point about disillusionment, this is like, yes, very. But this is one of the things, and I'm a huge sports person, right? Like I'm very competitive and like winning is a thing, but there can be a lot gained by things that fail, right? And my friend made this point last week at Trib Fest, at the Texas Tribune Fest, on a panel about was Texas good for women? And she went down to the Capitol and was with Wendy Davis in that big moment that galvanized a lot of people with the filibuster. And she worked on the campaign afterwards. And she's talked about, and Wendy Davis has apologized actually, for going small in that campaign, because I think that there's one of the things that the Dreams run head first into are these like structures that say, well, it's two parties and this, like, et cetera, et cetera. And she apologized because people like my friend who worked on that campaign said, well, if you know you're gonna lose, don't go out buying into the narrative that's already there. Swing for the fences, right? What does it mean to have somebody who is saying something that you actually like feel passionate about? And sometimes that means like a local election that you're like, this will never happen, right? But that's what they said in Georgia before it did. A lot of the places that we're talking that feel immovable are just really heavily suppressed, whether it's a suppression of information or access or a combination of everything. And I think that, I think about that a lot because it's also a reminder that I tell myself about not letting the disillusionment take away your own dreams and your own imagination and your own capacity to do that, because there has been countless times where I am like done. I'm just like done with it. I'm over it. And I have like one person who I see pushing forward and thinking boldly. And I'm like, there's at least one person on this planet right now who's inspiring me. And that recharges me. And then in turn allows me to recharge others, right? And so sometimes it's thinking of like, okay, voting is one tool. What are the other things I can do that push forward generally so that we can get to what feels like a more liberatory space?
Other questions? Yes.
Hi, first time caller, long time. So throughout American history, there have been multiple times where the youth vote, the young adult vote has really impacted elections. We have college movements in the early 60s, the late 60s, and then the early 2010s that really caused a lot of sea change. And you felt this college first youth movement happening that really led to national conversation. I don't feel that as much this election. And so I'm wondering, in y'all's perspectives, what conditions need to be present for a big college youth movement to happen? And how can college students here at UT now kind of start to engender that support over this last month, or even thinking further, how to start to ramp that up for the next 2 years?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's so historical. You want to go for it?
We need a revolution.
Yeah.
That's really what we need. We need a revolution. Because if you look at what happened in the 60s, the 50s, 60s, and 70s, all the groups were aligned together, right? That's how we got the 65 Civil Rights Act passed. That's how we got the Immigration Naturalization Act passed. That's how we got the Voting Rights Act passed. What happened in the 70s, right? And I've said this to, I see one of my students from before here, but, it was really the Bakke case. Bakke v. the University of California Regents v. Bakke. That was the case that split all the groups apart. And so I think that, again, what worked, what was the messaging that worked in the 60s and 70s, right? They drew inspiration from all sorts. It was Martin Luther King, decidedly also more Malcolm X, and even to a certain extent Mao Zedong in China, right? And I always tell people, like, you have this person in China who is literally an illiterate peasant, and he went around and he galvanized a whole class of people. How did he do that? Because he asked them, because they were going through the Great Famine at that time. And he went around to them He said, hey, are you hungry? Do you want to eat? Come with me. Because we adopted some of those principles, and a lot of the laws that we got passed, even in America during the civil rights era, was because Congress saw what happened in other parts of the world. They were not immune to it. And they saw, if our people can't eat, we are going to have issues, right? That's how a lot of the affirmative action, Title VII, Title VI, Title V frameworks got passed. So I think that, are we close to that point? We might be, but I agree. And I was just saying to my colleague earlier today, I don't see the excitement amongst the students, right? And that's the main thing, is when you, in the heart of an election year, even in 2016, and I base it on bumper stickers, right? The basics. And you don't see people wearing the stickers, and you're not hearing the conversations. It was a much different climate 8 years before that point. I still don't see it today, right? I think people are a little bit more revved up, but do they care enough right now? I don't know, right? And that's what I don't see enough of. But I do think if we get to that point, it would be a revolution, and hopefully we break apart into a 4-party system, and we actually get some stuff accomplished in this country.
Talk about expanding the vision.
Yeah. It's a really interesting moment, right? Because there's a few things that really galvanized youth movement that mirrored this moment of the 60s that you mentioned, which was really global too, right? You had Mexican students in Mexico City, right, protesting before the Olympics. You had people in France. You had people in Berkeley. It was a moment, right? And I think that we had tastes of that around things like climate change, and certainly after Parkland, the galvanization, especially of high school students, who then went to college and also had the collegiate experience completely disrupted by a pandemic, right? On the tail end of it. And I think that we have had a major shift because of that. Now we're just everything's back to normal. No, right? And I think that reestablishing those communal ties after we've been disconnected is really important. A lot of people are getting to campus and are coming from high schools where they haven't been in person, and they're like, oh my gosh, people, I'm going to the union, I'm going to football, this is where they're at, and there hasn't yet been a community established to buy into. And so I think that helps a lot. This is why you have to dream big, because those things that have been energizing have been moments of complete abject failure or tragedy, right? And I think sometimes that's what it requires. So it's how do you build up to that? How do you part of why we're coming down from this huge national election was because it was so it was okay, he's gone, it's done, right? But there's ways that I think a youth movement is so the key. And it's not just in college spaces, it's in high school spaces as well. And this is why banned books matter, because it's all connected. But yeah, I don't really have a lot of answers, because I think we're just seeing one side, we're just receiving the lack of, right? But I will say, again, that colleges are one of the most suppressed places that we overlook in the conversations about access, because we focus a lot on communities and stuff like that. And I think college spaces are so important, A, because a lot of people don't know where they should vote if they're from out of town, right? B, because they're actively suppressing votes on college campus. In College Station, there's one voting place. That's not gonna work, but it's intentional. And then 3, because a lot of times you can sit on a campus and not feel like you're of where it's in. So you're at UT, but you don't feel of Austin. So why should I care about local politics? You say, until you get picked up for smoking weed downtown, and suddenly you care very much about Austin politics. But I think that those connections, being able to bring the local onto campus and do that, means that you also have the opportunity to build youth networks with local high school students, people who are at community college, people at other universities. And I think that that's some of the directions that we can move in to try to galvanize that.
As an interjection, voting by mail deadline is October 28th for all of those who need to do that.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think, unfortunately, one of the things that does galvanize and does end up into yielding a revelation or a moment right, where we can envision kind of a better democracy, better future, is a moment of demise, right? And I actually think we're getting quite close to it. And I think I need not mention so many of the things that have happened over the last few months, but I think if we think about what we call quote unquote democracy as a whole, has been in decline, right? If we think about the insurrection, if we think about just over the last few years, how we've seen, with the Voting Rights Act, right? I think you have to think cumulatively about all of these issues over the last, 10, maybe 15 years. And I think we might be getting to a point where it would have shaken people up enough into, organize and mobilize. And I think then the question is, are there those structures in place for people to actually demand and push for change? And I think your point about the pandemic was just hit me, because I kept thinking a lot about just how important it is to have that connection with people, and how disruptive the pandemic was in terms of organizing, right? And I think that we saw on the Democratic side that, and on many groups that were on the left side, right, that they really took the pandemic seriously and try to engage folks more virtually, as opposed to those on the right side who really just did not do that and were really able to mobilize, their base and their voters in a different way. And that then had consequences in many places. And so I think that sort of trickles down also to other parts of our society, but I do think that we are getting to a point that it might shake people up to such an extent that if the opportunity structure is right, then we might see a positive shift. But I think my sort of concern is, if it's not right, what's going to happen when we hit that kind of cracking point?
Or the disillusionment, like, because I feel like we've hit that brink multiple times in the last few years. And like even the pandemic, like when you find yourself arguing about the existence of something that's killed millions of people that we don't like want to deal with anymore, it can be what is soul sucking, So I think part of it is that reconnection, but like also reestablishing that imagination, because we have hit that moment that you're looking back and you're like, okay, 3 years ago, this would have been enough to be a revolution. Like this would have been, is this going to be the moment? And then after a while, you're like, it's not coming. Like it's just not happening. And I think that those are the moments that feel the bleakest, and also where you have to reach out the most to those places that are still like have some fuel moving forward.
Yeah, I think that one of the problems with collective action, I'm going to talk about the United States, but I think it's also the case in other places, is that we're moved to act when we see something terrible happen, right? It's a particular incident. It's not injustice overall. And so, Black Lives Matter protests happened because, right, we all watched George Floyd being murdered. And if that didn't happen, we never would have had any of those protests. And so, what is it going to be this time? As you were saying, right, what is the point, right? We watched what happened in Uvalde, and we didn't necessarily see, right, that kind of movement. So, I think a lot, I go back to media. I think media has a lot to do with this. We don't have, if I turn on the television, right, I am guaranteed to see something about Trump, who is no longer our president, on the television. But I'm not going to see what's happening with reproductive rights. I'm not going to see what's happening, as far as Texas is concerned with gun control, right, or with trans rights. I'm not going to see any of that. So we're not consuming it on a daily basis, and we don't have that particular incident that makes everybody so mad that they feel like they have to run out of their house. And so we're left with this kind of lull that we're all experiencing. And so I'm just hoping that it's a lull that exists in collective action, but that folks will go to the polls and they will turn out in big numbers. And I think maybe I'm being overly optimistic, but I hope I'm not. But I think that's the problem. It's that, there's a particular incident that causes us all to go out, and then we all forget, and that's, it's not sustainable. That's a very not a great note to end on. But I do want to encourage you all to get involved. Again, we're going to have our event on the 25th that talks about the ballot specifically. It's going to be happening during early voting, so you can get information on the ballot and then you can go out and vote that very same day. That's the hope, and so we encourage you all to come back. I want to thank our panelists for being here and for sharing such useful information, and thank you all for coming.
Quick plug. So if you haven't registered, the registration's on the 11th. I think Professor Cleland mentioned this at the beginning. Yeah. And I don't know if it's up here already. October 11th. And so if you go to, I think it's Vote Texas.
Well, the
There it
QR
is.
code's right
The QR code's right there.
There's also a QR code right there.
Or right
on
here.
this slide.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, votetexas.gov. And then you can either fill out the application and mail it to the address of your county register office, or drop it off in person, but it's easier to mail it. And if you're a college student, you can register to vote in the county here, or you can decide to vote in your home county if you're from Texas. So you have multiple options. There is information on how to specifically vote as a college student on the university website. But if you have any questions, feel free to ask us, and we'll be happy to share more resources with you.